Okay. Now that I start recording, a whole bunch of people logged in. So hang on one sec. We're expanding the number of Christophers, which is always good. And then I missed one of the people that just came in, so I may have to go back and do roll one more time toward the end of class, but we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Somebody told me they're here. All right. Yeah. Goodness. So, it's election day 2020. The day we've been waiting for a long time, mostly so we don't have to watch commercials anymore. I'm amazed at how if we elect the wrong person, our country will completely fall apart. That's what every commercial says. And schools will be demolished and will be unsafe, and the police will be defunded, or they'll beat us up, or I don't know. It's exhausting, isn't it? But you know it's not exhausting is history, except when you're grading. So every time I'm grading, I always think, why did I assign stuff? But then I remember you have to do stuff to get credit. So I think that I've graded most of the stuff from the last unit, from unit 2, and I'll start working on unit 3 stuff because, dang, yeah, I don't want to get too far behind. And some of you have turned stuff in, so that's cool. But what I did notice on that last question, the New Deal question, is a lot of stuff that looked a lot like plagiarism. So I just wanted to go over this just a touch. So when you are using sources, especially online sources, I know it's a huge temptation just to kind of cut and paste, but let's not do that. Because then I don't really know if you understand stuff. So if you can put it in your own words, it's better. You know that it runs through a plagiarism check, which gives me a pretty good clue. But honestly, when you use words that no one ever uses, and what the heck is it with students who say whilst? Do you guys really say that, whilst? It makes me wonder, are you guys finding some British online sources that you're just copying and pasting whilst? Really? Do you say that? But but there's some other words that are pretty good clues that you have borrowed from an online source. So um, don't,
Uh, if I may, as far as whilst, if it
okay.
was me,
Yes.
lately in my English too, it's a big word right now. So I don't know if it
Okay.
was planted in my brain, but if it was
Okay.
me, I'm sorry. That's why.
Okay. No, you're fine. It's so many people though. I mean, somebody, I like the note on there, British wife. That makes perfect sense. Almost everyone I know from the UK says whilst, and I just go like whilst, and they always say my. Okay, I'm bragging on the. Can I say that? Sorry, complaining. Oh gosh, now I did just reveal how old I am. But complaining about British English, which is lovely, by the way. But no, I read whilst all the time in your writing. It's not, just one or two of you. It's all the time, and I'm thinking but if it's in your English class or you've all married British people, that makes sense. But all my British friends always say myself all the time instead of my, which I think is interesting. Oh, but Alex, you just said myself in the right context. I don't mean it. Right? I'm going to stop talking about this stuff. But whilst isn't really the big problem. Okay. Oh gosh. See, now you're all putting comments in that make me feel bad. So okay, say whilst all you like, but I was curious. It's like, why is it? And it's in all 3 of my classes too. So I see whilst a lot. But yeah, and I get too that sometimes you're looking up synonyms, but some of these are like really specific, I'm a history professor or writer kind of words. So just make sure that whatever words you put in your answer, you actually know what they mean. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? I probably told you the story that I had first semester I taught a long time ago, 18 years ago. First semester I taught for ACC. Somebody used the word hagiography in their in the first paragraph of their paper, and then they were 16. It's like, yeah, you don't know. So it means no one should know what that means. If you do, I'm not trying to be rude to you, but it means when you write about somebody in a historical context, you make them sound like a saint, you deify them. So for us in US history, it'd be George Washington or something, potentially, but nobody in the modern era for sure. All right, but just watch out. If I'm telling you that it looks like maybe you're borrowing a little too much, I'm really just asking you to make sure you put it in your own words. And I don't put the plagiarism check to where you can see the results, in part because I think it would distress you, because almost everybody's paper comes up with at least a third of your paper being plagiarized, but it's because you're all writing about the same thing. And if you include the question in your answer, it shows up even more. And I promise you, I recognize that. But when yours is about 100%, that's, yeah, that stresses me out a little. So, and it makes me, spend a little extra time looking over your sourcing. So, but make sure it sounds like you should sound, and we're good. And don't say it in ways that don't make sense to you. That makes any? Okay, I'm going to stop talking about that. Instead, I will try to share the notes with you. All right, I've offended everyone from Europe, so I apologize about that, and everyone that likes to use the word whiles. And so I'm not even going to try to talk about politics. I wouldn't want to anyway. Goodness, yeah, like you, I'm just glad that thing's almost over. That thing being the election. All right, sorry, I was looking for the make it slightly bigger button because, I'm getting older. Someday I'm going to break out those reading glasses, but not yet. A couple more years. All right, I feel like we're ready to talk about chapter 24. And chapter 24 starts off a little bit. I think it talks a little bit about the Nixon-Kennedy stuff going on, and how really prosperous that era was, the late 50s, or excuse me, the late 40s into about 1960. This is an amazing time for the United States financially. It's also an amazing time for us when we go like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be so racist. So we're going to make a lot of changes. And I think some of you, especially younger yous, you get really down on the country. It's like, oh my gosh, it's the most racist country I've ever seen. And if you study all sorts of countries, what you notice is, yeah, that seems to be a human tendency. Not really sure why. I think it's very sad. But I think maybe this era will encourage you a little bit that we're starting to fix stuff, and then it will discourage you a little bit that it was so hard to fix stuff. But I don't know, change. It's difficult. All right, but we'll start following along with the notes. And then before we go, I'll take a peek at the weekly question and give you some suggestions. So I know normally I kind of do that more at the beginning, but we'll look at it for the end. All right. The book starts off talking about Nixon and the kitchen debate. And this is when Nixon is the vice president. He is Eisenhower's vice president. And I have to put in the website for you. I know you love history as much as I do, but there's a website called The Living Room Candidate. And although you don't want to watch any more campaign commercials, I know some of the ones from the old days are kind of funny or kind of clever. And the Eisenhower administration, the first campaign is when you really start to see campaign commercials on TV, because at this point is when late 40s, early 50s, is when people start to have televisions in their homes. And then by the end of the 50s, pretty much everybody watches TV. So you have like cartoons going around with bass drums and singing, I like Ike, you like Ike, everybody likes Ike. I mean, they're just kind of fun commercials. And then in the 60s, we get to the everyone will die if you don't vote for my candidate commercials. So you get the more negative campaigning coming in later. But the Living Room Candidate site has lots of commercials from different time periods, which is, to me, kind of interesting. It might be to you if you had more free time. But of course, the big issue in this era is the Cold War. Is the United States better than the Soviet Union? And you know the answer. Of course it is. But this kitchen debate was kind of a specific discussion between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev about material abundance, as I say in the notes, who's got the best stuff. And we're talking consumer goods at this point. We've talked very publicly in that era about who had the best military weapons. Do you have other sorts of weapons? Well, I know you have guns because it's Texas. God bless Texas. But you know, we certainly had an arms race that everyone was aware of. But we also talked about who had the better opportunity to buy stuff and who had better stuff to buy. So whose manufacturing sector was better? And of course, in this era, woohoo, United States, man, we can make some stuff. We still can, I'm not saying. It's just we also import a lot of stuff now too, which we didn't as much back then. But this was actually, they call it the kitchen debate because they were talking about different kitchen appliances and who could purchase the best things because they were at a kitchen an appliance expo, I think, is what it was called. But it was in the Soviet Union, and it was to show off the productivity in the Soviet Union and also the kind of general, I don't know that equality is the right word, but how everybody had a very nice quality of consumer appliances. So they showed off the latest washing machine or dryer or mixer or refrigerator or oven, that sort of thing. And Khrushchev was saying, you know, in our country, everyone has this. This is what everyone has, and it's very good. And then Nixon said, well, in our country, everyone has freedom of choice. And, you know, maybe you want a smaller freezer, but a larger refrigerator, or maybe you don't really use the oven, but you want more burners on top of the stove, or, you know, you have more options that way. I don't know if they had dishwashers yet, kind of early, and I don't think they had microwaves, but the argument was, do we want to have some sort of equality where everybody has a decent standard of living, or do we want to have this variety where everybody has the option that suits them best, even though it may be unequal? And of course, in the United States, we're going to argue that that variety that might be unequal is better. We're also going to eventually argue that even the lowest level of whatever it is people have in the United States is probably better than what most people have in foreign countries. And there's some truth to that, and then there's some not truth to that. This is also the era where, because we are so affluent, hence the name of the chapter, it's also the name of a book written by John Kenneth Galbraith, who you could read that for your book review. It might be a little, it's not going to be fun, but it would be interesting. And it talks about, you know, how much wealth has been accumulated in this era and how this may be the time where we could eliminate poverty. So there's going to be a lot of discussion about how to go about that in this era. And you'll see that discussion continue into the 60s. Excuse me. But back to this. So this is referred to as the golden age of capitalism. The assumption is because of this affluence, the United States would win the Cold War. And there's certain historians that would argue that that really is the reason the United States won the Cold War, because we're really good at producing stuff. And because the Soviet Union tried to keep up with this, they went broke. And there's some truth to that. There's some other things going on. But, you know, that is a big deal. They're going to have some issues getting enough food for their folks. And yeah, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so golden age of capitalism, and it's marked by economic expansion, stable prices. So, you know, prices don't go up very much during this era. Unemployment remains really low, and standard of living rises consistently for 25, 30 years. GNP is gross national product. So it's what is produced in the United States. The value of what's produced in the United States more than doubles in this era. And the poverty rate falls from 30 to 22%, which is pretty big fall. I know some of you are going, I can't believe a third of the people were poor in the, no, it was a lot. But the real wages rising, I think what's unique about that in this era is that they rise across the board. So it's not just people in the upper categories. Typically, when we see an economic expansion, you see an enormous expansion at the top that isn't replicated in the middle or at the bottom. But this era is the real growth of the middle class. So I was going to say people like, I don't know, probably, most people in the United States. I don't know. The idea of middle class in this era, it's much different now, I think. I don't even know who decides. Is that you would be able to purchase a home, that you'd be able to afford to have children. Um, Although you can certainly have children whether you can afford them or not. My parents would attest to that. They're not watching, so I can say that. But people also wanted to have a family life, raise the kids in the suburbs. So we had ideas of what it was like to be middle class, but that home ownership thing or having a house was the key. And that was fairly affordable during this time period in a way that probably isn't true now. Although I would also suggest that if you are a little younger than me or a lot, don't even say that you are, I know that you are, owning a home is probably not on your list at this moment. I mean, it might be later. Yeah, it's not necessarily the thing that folks in their 20s put on their list. You have other things on your list. All right, real wages rise and the age at which we marry falls a lot. So it's really typical in this era to get married in your late teens, usually 18-ish, like the end of year 18 or the beginning of year 19. I know, let's see, well, I'm from the Ozarks. I know I've mentioned this more than once. So my people who got married, a lot of them just, procreated when they were really young. But my parents were 19. I think all my brothers were 19 when they got married. I was old. I was 21. But people got married earlier then. I know my husband's parents, crud, I think my mother-in-law was 16, but she is from a slightly different generation. She's about 9. So a little younger and for different reasons. But anyway, the gap between the rich and poor narrows, which really is unusual. It's a big deal. It really is. Manufacturing is a dominant industry in the United States, so that production is what really builds the middle class. So there's a bunch of people working in factories where you make stuff, and it's really automobile production that causes that big rise in certain areas of the country and industries related to automobile production. So it's sort of like the 20s economy on steroids as far as the automobile industry. And because there are unions that are pretty successful and the automobile industry is very successful, auto workers make a lot of money during this time period, more than teachers. Can you imagine as much money as teachers make? Auto workers make more, which enabled people who worked at factories who produced cars to be in the middle class, to buy homes and put their kids through college if their kids wanted to go to college. This is not really an era where a bunch of people go to college, although the people who do often are in the military because of the GI Bill. Yeah. Right, sorry, I'm writing down whoever just came in. Okay, all right. So manufacturing dominates. Service and information related professions will start to increase and then sort of take their place by the end of this era. Agricultural production increases, but the number of farmers decreases. Now, I'm from the Midwest, as we've mentioned many times, I'm sure. So where I grew up was a farming region. So when this happens in a farming region, then you end up with some strange shifts in your economy. And if your economy doesn't adapt well, which was probably true in rural Missouri and Oklahoma and Iowa and Nebraska, if there aren't other jobs that take those spots, then you end up with, we'll just go with a lot of poverty, which is certainly what I remember from my childhood. So lots of people really struggling to find work in a place where their skills were probably predominantly agricultural or manual labor. So if those industries don't pick up, if the population doesn't increase, then it becomes true. Agriculture changes because of mechanization and because farms become corporate. So, instead of running a farm, you invest in a farm at this point. So Machinery, fertilizers, insecticide, irrigation, all those things help. And I realize that some of those things, primarily fertilizer and insecticide, will become environmentally controversial. So it's very easy to make things to help the crops be more productive and more hardy, but sometimes the pesticides have negative side effects. And we'll also discover that during this era. Grain crops are produced heavily in the deep south and the Midwest, my people, and then the people just slightly east of us. Fruits and vegetables in the west, Texas, Arizona, and California. Certain regions of Arizona. Some of you may have lived in Arizona and you thought, it's just a giant desert. In some places, it's just a giant desert. In other places, you can grow stuff. No, I have some relatives that I told them, that there are a lot of fruit. There's a lot of fruit production and vegetable in Texas, and they didn't believe me. So like, it's just cactus and oil. And I went, well, in certain regions. Yeah. So Arizona is kind of the same way, although it is more cactus. And California, what a weird place. All right. Everything in California. So one of the big things, and you'll certainly want to know this for the quiz kind of thing, is that residential construction grows rapidly. What I mean is home building. So it's like the whole world is Central Texas during this time period where people are moving, building houses and that sort of thing. So the demand for housing increases dramatically. And people are moving out of cities during this time period. Before, you wanted to live kind of close to where you work. Now it's kind of a sign of affluence and maybe just an expectation of that suburban lifestyle that you move to the edge of the city or to an actual community outside the city. This is enabled by the cheap fuel sources that we have during this time period. Gas is super cheap. It's like 20 cents a gallon, 25 cents a gallon, which is why we didn't care that the cars got 10 miles to the gallon or 15. All those 50s cars that look really fun, they look like, I don't know, space vehicles, or I don't know what they look like, rockets, I don't know. They have those big wings and things like that. My older brother is always posting pictures of old cars on Facebook, and all the people his age and older go like, those were the days when cars were really great. So the days when cars were really great, and they made them out of really heavy metal, and if you had a wreck, it would knock over a tree, that sort of thing. But there's no fuel efficiency because we didn't care. I mean, it just wasn't a thing back then. But having that car meant you could live in the suburb, you could drive to work, and it's also going to lead to the development of lots of other industries as well. Okay, the first suburbs, historians always like to point this out, so since I am one and you're in a history class, the first suburbs typically are sometimes referred to as Levitt towns because the developers William and Albert Levitt built some of the earliest suburbs. The biggest Levitt town was in Long Island, New York. And these are the spec homes. I don't know if you live in a suburb. I'm fancy now, so I live in a suburb. At least that's what my relatives tell me, that I'm sophisticated now. But in my little suburb, although, oh my goodness, my neighborhood, somebody started building houses and then they went broke, and then someone else came in and started building houses. So it's a little different, but usually suburbs have like 5 or 6 different styles of houses, and then they just have different facades. You can get a different color of brick or siding or white stone in this area, that sort of thing. But in that time period, there probably were just 1 or 2 different styles of houses, and they probably really did look the same. And they're usually either split level or single level homes that kind of go along the landscape. They seem to think that was more pleasing during that time period. I will also suggest, as an older person, there's some value to having a single story house as you get older, because sometimes those stairs are a little daunting. But the point here was to have it kind of along the landscape or the terrain of your house, and it was more pleasing, that sort of thing. But in this era as well, you want your house to look like everybody's house, because everybody wants to fit in. Fitting in is part of the thing of the 50s. I would always tell my high school students, it's like the country was a giant middle school. So you didn't want to stand out at all. And if you did, it's like, oh, people will make fun of me. Or in this area, they might think you're a communist. It's hard to say. All right, so it didn't matter to people that all the houses looked pretty similar. That was kind of the idea. So similar subdivisions are developed across the country outside of major cities. And it also leads to the development of shopping malls. Woo, okay. And drive-in theaters, drive-in restaurants, and also this is where when road trips become important and or trendy, I guess, and going on vacation. People didn't go on vacation so much before this era. Now that you've got a car and cheap gasoline, and by the end of the decade, really good highways, you're going to go on vacation. You're going to drive across the United States. It's also going to make national parks trendier. So this is an important, exciting era for the United States in a lot of ways, economically. But if you look at the whole of the era, you also know we've got some weird foreign policy stuff going on where we're constantly threatening to nuke the crap out of the Soviet Union, and they're threatening the same thing to us. We have a name for that. It's called massive retaliation or mutually assured destruction. It's not called threatening to nuke the crap out of people. So apologies for that. And we also have the civil rights movement. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff going on during this era. So parts of it look really fun, parts of it look really serious, and it's both. It's an interesting time period. But I think that economic stability is what leads us to the point of looking at change. Because I think when everybody's broke, we're just scrambling for food, or our necessities. When there's kind of a general affluence, that's when you have a time to make changes if you're so inclined. Sometimes people just get so, I don't know what's the right word, where all you're concerned about is like your own life. So you just want to be happy and your family happy and your kids happy, that kind of stuff, that you're not as concerned about fixing the community. So I think that's what you see at the beginning of this period. And then at the end of this period, people start to look outward and go like, oh, we got to fix this for other people. All right. So Levittown, this section, sorry. Okay, back over here. Okay, over here. Let's go here. So, importance of the automobile and interstate highways. Okay, so we passed the Interstate Highway Act during one of the Eisenhower administrations. I feel like it's passed in '53. I don't remember for sure. Clearly, that's not going to be a question, is it? Because if I don't remember, I probably don't think it's crucial that you remember. Do remember, though, this happens in the Eisenhower administration, and it's paid for by defense funding, which is fascinating. The reason we build interstate highways is really one main reason. It's because if the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union invade the United States, we're going to have to get troops and material and all the other sort of stuff back and forth on the highways. Plus, we're going to need places for planes to land. Yes. So that's why interstate highways, every once in a while, they have a stretch of like 2 miles, I think it is, that's completely straight. It's also why all of the bridges and the overpasses have to be a certain height to make sure you can get the military vehicles underneath them. So these were really built to transport the military to get troop movements back and forth the United States in case we got invaded by the evil, godless communists and we needed to get troops from one part of the country to another. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, because I've seen some of your faces. You guys look young. The Soviet Union never invaded the United States. However, these roads are really important because they're going to enhance the economy in a really dramatic way. So this is going to enable shipping of goods in a way that we've never had before, and also internal transportation for vacations. So now people can go on vacation because we have reliable roads, and the trucking industry is just going to boom, and it will become cheaper to transport goods by truck than it is by train. Now, truthfully, it is still cheaper to use a train to transport your goods if you live near train stations. But if you have to, if you don't have train tracks where you're going, everybody's got interstate highways now. So interstate highways, crucial, really important to the development of the economy, tourist economy, the restaurant economy, and just the economy, the shipping of goods back and forth across the country. So really big deal, not for the reason that we thought it would be, but it's really important. Really important. Yeah, it's why maybe you made the road trips, or we have Chevy Chase's vacation movies. Yeah, okay. Where you go to Wally World. I think I've seen most of one of those movies. Wally World. All right, here's some other stuff you had to do in the 50s. Have some kids. You needed to have some kids. You did. The ideal, I think the average was like 3.2 kids or something like that. My parents, they were pretty good. They had 4. So, and one of us is really short. My younger brother's shorter than me. And I'm really short. You can't tell, but you just believe me. But 3 or 4 kids, house in the suburbs, 2-car garage, probably 1 car, because that was pretty typical. But, you have to have room for your stuff, because you accumulate a lot of stuff if you live in the suburbs. You fill your house with stuff. So you got to have kids, though. That's the expectation. I remember I mentioned that people thought McCarthy, in part, was, problematic because he was unmarried and didn't have children. So the expectation is you get married young, you have kids, and you have them early, and you have a bunch of them. And your wife, even though you're buying a lot of stuff, and she's probably got to work at least part-time, her main job is to be a good wife and mother. So much so that when you have a baby in the hospital, which was typical, even my parents were born in a hospital in the Ozarks. But when you have the baby during that era, you got a copy of a book called Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care, which told you how to take care of your kid and how to be a good mother. And if you didn't do what was in that book, if your child, you deviated from that, then your child could turn out to be a communist or a gay communist, which would be the worst possible thing. So any mistake you made could be magnified in that child's life. So I'm going to suggest to you that mothers who were raised in the 50s were pretty intense. I'm going to suggest to you that because my mother was raised in the 50s, and it was, oh my gosh, it was so important to my mother that, especially in public, that we were perfect all the time, because if we weren't, it reflected badly on her, and that was her primary job. And I think, when she passed, my older brother, looked through a lot of her stuff, and they found like stories that she wrote when she was in high school about how she was going to get married and have kids. She wrote songs about it. She practiced writing her married name. I don't think my dad was the person she intended to marry when she was fantasizing about getting married, because I think she was hoping for a guy with more money. No offense, Dad. My dad did well, over time, but not, when he was 18. So, but, she even wrote her name to where it wasn't, my mom's name was Cindy Lou Hayes, but she didn't write like Mrs. Cindy whatever, or Mrs. Cindy Lou whatever she thought her last name would be, but she wrote Mrs., like my dad's name is James Sowers, so she wrote Mrs. James Sowers. So when you got married in that era as a woman, not only did you change your last name, you kind of became Mrs. whatever your husband's name was. So you really do kind of lose your identity, which will set you up for a discussion we'll have a little bit later. But your roles were supposed to be traditional. If your kids didn't act right, then, that was the mom's fault. And if they turned out badly, that was also the mom's fault. And the book suggested that you were on call, like 100, the book, Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care, suggested that you were kind of on call all the time. So if your kid's crying in the middle of the night, you got to be there, really, even before they cry. And, you know, you don't want the child to be stressed out because then they might become a gay communist or something, or they won't be able to read properly, or they won't behave properly, or they won't get good grades in school. And if they don't, it means you're a failure as a mother. And, you know, again, gay communist kid. Nobody wants that. So, uh, ah. And this was also the eras like, and you guys might have heard this as children as well, but you behave properly because if you don't, it reflects badly upon your family. So you got to make sure your family is always honored. So there you go. You don't want your family to look bad. I know we didn't, because then my mom would be mad. I don't think we had any thoughts beyond that. We just didn't want our mom mad. Here's another thing you're doing in the 50s. You are going to church. Yes, you are. Whether you want to go to church or not, you are going to church because that's what everybody did. We went to church. And I grew, oh my goodness, I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, gateway to the Ozarks, and we had more churches than any, I bet we had more churches than any other place in the country. There's probably a church every mile. I mean, we had so many, well, there's way more than that. But we also went to church like 3 times a week. We just, church, it was our thing. Now in the 50s, people went to church a lot. Now, the one thing that you see change about church, I don't want to say it becomes more nationalized, but it kind of does. There's kind of this merge of religious tradition with national tradition. That's also the era, I know we mentioned this before, where we put God in the Pledge of Allegiance. So as long as you go to church and you go to a church that encourages you to be obedient, to obey the law, that sort of thing, and you embraced that faith tradition, then you were good. So this is really an era where we care a lot less whether you're Protestant or Catholic, and we even like you if you're Jewish, which may not have been just true like 20 years before. Now, if you're wondering, is this an era where we're cool with Muslims and Buddhists? And no, it's early for that. And this is also an era where, you know, in most parts of the country, that's still going to be a really small minority group. If you are Muslim or Buddhist, or goodness, if you are agnostic or atheist, I don't think this is a good time for you to share those beliefs. 50s, yeah, we loved God. We loved religion. So church attendance is really on the rise, and it's kind of this power of positive thinking sort of tradition. So I think this is also where you start to see, except for Baptists, a little bit of a movement away, well, and also, yeah, Church of Christ, a little bit of movement away from you being scared of hell all the time, and more about, you know, doing good, positive thinking, being productive, that sort of thing. So religion sort of homogenizes, if I can say that. Can I say that? Are you okay with that? All right, I'm going to stop sharing for a second just to see if you guys have any questions, or see if you're still with me. Church 3 times a week? Are you guys up for that? It's a lot of church. It's a lot of church. Wow. All right, do you guys have questions? I had to stop because I've talked so much. Let me look for the weekly question.
Actually, when I was growing up, and my best friend across the street, their family went 6 times a week.
That's impressive. That's a lot.
Almost every night except for Saturdays for some reason.
That is a lot of church.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I would make some speculation about what denomination that might be, but I don't want to get in trouble. I've already gotten in trouble a couple times. Oh, you guys are trying to figure out where everybody's from. I know. You guys should talk about that stuff in the chat. That's good. Kind of get to know each other a little. 6 times a week, that's a lot of church. We always went 3. And then Sunday was sometimes an all-day affair. A lot of church. All right, let me see if I can remember how to share the weekly question. There we go. All right. Okay, so this week's weekly question is about the civil rights movement. So this is probably not going to be the thing we talk about today, but it does kind of lead up to a little bit of the thing we talk about today, because I do think it does take that unity, that post-World War II unity, that us versus them unity, Cold War unity, and then that affluence that starts to develop to get us to start to think about other things other than, survival. What's mine is mine, and I don't want you to have any of it. Plus, if we're trying to look good on the international stage, maybe racism doesn't help us. And World War II, we'll talk really specifically about the civil rights movement next time, of course. But World War II gives a lot of people of color experiences overseas and also military training. I don't know if you know military people. I know a couple of you are military people because you've shared that. But you folks are different. You're not like me where it's like you're constantly apologizing for stuff. And it's like, I got to be nervous about things. You guys, most of the time, it's like, I'm confident. I went through basic training. I'm in shape most of the time. I know how to use these weapons. I'm in a leadership position. I'm saving the world. So, you're in charge. You're in charge. And that training that you have gives you this sort of presence and confidence. Now, if you fought in World War II and you defeated the Nazis, let's say you're a black guy in the Deep South, and you go back home, and then there's some old cranky old racist dude who says like, hey, and calls you a name, you can't use this water fountain. It's like, dude, I defeated the Nazis. I will use whichever water fountain I want to use. So it really does kind of change the attitude of people in the South, even though it's still very dangerous to tell that old dude, I'm going to use whatever water fountain I want to. You see this push for change that I think is in part inspired by that confidence that you get from military service. And one of the things you'll notice if you look carefully is a lot of the people like James Meredith or Heman Sweat, the guy that integrated UT Law School, and a lot of the people who worked with the NAACP, and I think Oliver Brown also had a military background, the guy in Brown versus Board of Education. These folks come back and it's like, yeah, we're not putting up with this foolishness anymore. It's just a whole new world. And I know some of you are going, it's peaceful, nonviolent civil rights movement. That's true. It is true. But if you read behind the scenes, there's some really interesting stuff being written in the modern era about the civil rights movement back then. And the dads who fought in World War II primarily, but occasionally World War I, when their kids were peacefully, non-violently protesting, sometimes they were on the roofs of buildings with sniper rifles. So there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff going on that I think is really fascinating. Yeah. All right, back to the notes, maybe. We'll see. Now, I do think those kind of behind the scenes things that we don't always get in the textbook, those are really crucial. Those are important things. All right, back to business here, although some of that was business. All right, so importance, we talked about church. Oh, I didn't mention this. But I think, you could already tell I'm not great with popular culture, but I saw this movie, Pleasantville, and Pleasantville, the guy that was Spider-Man is in it, and then some really cute blonde actress who's famous, and I don't know who she is. They were like brother and sister in the 50s, and they get sucked up into this TV show. No, they were brother and sister in the 80s or 90s. And the brother was upset because his family life wasn't perfect. His mom was divorced. His sister was out of control. And he was just like a little schoolboy kind of dude who just did what he was supposed to do and got good grades. And he felt like he was the 50s. So he wished he kind of lived in the 50s, I think. So he got sucked into this TV show that he watched all the time, which was a lot like the Andy Griffith Show. And it was in black and white. And when he became part of the show, his sister got sucked in there too. But what they found out is that anytime they did something out of the norm, they got color. So they covered themselves up essentially with black and white makeup. So it was really kind of interesting. But anytime you were anything that wasn't traditional, you changed color and people ostracized you, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And then sorry, I was checking the chats, like now we know where people are from. But what they figured out by the end of the film is that a lot of people that they really liked and respected had differences that they needed to express, and then that made the world, more colorful, therefore better. It's I don't know, kind of interesting, and of course it's one of those hindsight sort of things. But the 50s, fit again. All right, politics. Both the parties are fairly similar in lots of important ways. They're both strong on defense. They're both anti-communist. Rural and regional differences. The Solid South always voted for Democrats. I know some of you are going like, that's not even true. In my whole lifetime, the South votes for Republicans, and you are right because you're young. However, that started in the 80s. You can blame or credit Reagan with that if you like, and it's fair. But before that, really from the beginning of time, no, not the beginning of time, but probably 1830s to 1960s for sure. You see some change in the 60s, but with Reagan, you see the big shift. The South always voted for Democrats. Cities in the modern era, 20th century beyond, vote for Democrats. California loved Republicans then. I know you're going like, no. Yes, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, both from California. And the Midwest is usually Republican. And part of that is because the Republicans might have been a little more free thinking. And I don't know if you've ever been to the upper Midwest, because I think we sort of picture the Midwest as all like super conservative, but the upper Midwest is a little more, it's where all the Swedes and Norwegians came from. And they tend to value public school and those free thinking kind of religious differences. So they're a little different than you might expect them to be. But anyway, all right. Sorry, weird noise in my house. So as far as the different parties, lots of similarities, some regional differences. Midwesterners usually vote for Republicans. Democrats are more pro-union, and that really goes back to the Truman veto of the Taft-Hartley Act, which I may have mentioned in passing once or twice. Foreign policy, Democrat or Republican, you hate the Soviet Union, and you want to build up the military to a point where we could nuke the Soviet Union off the planet at least 10 times. John Foster Dulles is going to be the architect of massive retaliation or mutually assured destruction, which is a foreign policy / arms race that ensures that if the Soviet Union starts stuff, because we're good and wholesome and pure, we're not going to start stuff, but if they start stuff, that we can end it more than they can, so that our response will be lethal and that it will be able to stop their response. Because I know some of you are thinking, like, if they nuke you first, what chance do you have? But we're going to develop stuff to maybe intercept their stuff or to get there faster than their stuff gets to us. So it's a dangerous time. Well, these people were nervous during that time period. They were. I guess we're nervous too, but just about different things. What you end up with Eisenhower is somebody who probably moderates on those ideas a little bit, which is why when he leaves office, he is going to suggest that we need to be more concerned about what he refers to as the military-industrial complex. So the group of people who work for the defense industry and the group of people who lead the defense industry, because it's a symbiotic relationship. All right, somebody trying to say something. I mean to cut you off.
November.
It'd be funny to see how long you could.
All right.
No. November is for.
So I'll keep going, I think.
Well,
if there's something you want to say, go ahead and put it in the chat.
No,
if your
for
audio isn't working. I'm looking in the chat. Okay, so it's just somebody's microphone being on. All right. Isn't this what we always say during Zoom meetings? Turn your microphone off, or you're still muted. Those are the things we say. All right. I think I might have figured out who it is, but if I muted you and you didn't mean to be muted, sorry. All right. Military industrial complex, that's where we were. So Eisenhower had concern about this. And the reason I think this is probably more important than, I don't know, sometimes we overlook this a little bit, because Eisenhower is about as military a dude as we're ever going to have as president. So his experience with the military is pretty vast. So when he says we need to be careful about this because there are people who profit from war and there are people who want to try out new stuff for war, and that they control a lot of the aspects of the defense industry and the military, and that we need to be cautious and have more oversight of those regions, or those industries and services, then he's probably somebody we should, that should be listened to. So his concern was that the people who developed the weapons and the people who wanted to use the weapons would feed an expensive and potentially dangerous arms race, which may have been unnecessary. Now, during this era, we'll also, try to launch a satellite. And because the Soviet Union gets theirs into orbit sooner than we get ours into orbit, we're going to argue that we're behind on defense technology and that we need to spend more money. And Eisenhower's discussion of this is in part a response to that. It's like, maybe, maybe not. So, but it will lead to a push for more spending in education as well, because part of the reason we're behind in defense technology is the kids are lazy and stupid. Yeah, kids, lazy and stupid. And all they do is drive their fast cars and go to sock hops. So they don't study science and math and foreign language so they can be spies. All right. So Nixon's use of television. So this is discussed a little bit during this time period, and the importance of television in politics is pretty crucial. I know it's a little different now because you probably, like me, you get texts every day about how you should vote for this person or that person or contribute money to that person or this person, although not as much now because, they probably don't need any money now. But in this era, everybody's gotten a television. Everybody's obsessed with their television, so they're watching it all the time. And there's only like 3 different channels. So if it's on TV, it's probably on all 3 channels, and it creates a common popular culture. So Nixon uses television really well. Round 1 with the checkers speech. Nixon is Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate in 1952. Eisenhower doesn't really like Nixon. Nixon is, sorry, I looked at the chat for a question. It's like, yeah, that question's not for me. Nixon is a little too far. I don't know that he's too far right. He's pretty conservative, but Eisenhower's more of that traditional Republican, and then Nixon's more of the punch you in the face Republican. Is that fair for me to say? But he's a little more intense. Eisenhower's a little more mainstream and a little more acceptable to upper middle class and upper class Republicans. So he would say that he's liberal with people and conservative with money, and Nixon's just conservative. And Nixon has some pretty harsh campaigning techniques, and he's looking for communists and that sort of thing. Eisenhower is much more low-key, which is kind of funny maybe, because that may not be the way you think of military guys, but I think at least on the surface, you got to be, low-key. So, except in battle or something. But here we have, Eisenhower is your traditional Republican, but to appeal to different parts of the electorate, they've picked Nixon. Eisenhower does not want Nixon on the ticket. They don't like each other at all. Nixon gets accused during the campaign of misusing some campaign funds for personal reasons. So he goes to television, gives a speech, and he kind of makes his wife sit there in the speech, and she apparently hated it. But he talks about how they're really kind of poor, his wife doesn't have a mink coat, but she has a respectable Republican cloth coat, and that he did accept some gifts during the campaign. But that gift that he accepted was a dog, and it was a Cocker Spaniel, and I think it was a Cocker Spaniel. And his name was Checkers, and his children, who are his children? Julie and Krista, I think? I can't remember. But his two daughters loved the dog, and he wasn't going to give it back. So, and then he says, call the Republican National Committee and tell them that you want to keep me on the ticket. So people did, and Eisenhower was stuck with him. So Nixon uses television really well in the Checkers instance. Not as well in the Nixon-Kennedy debate, which we'll talk about a little bit more next time, because most of our talk next time is going to be about civil rights. But Nixon runs against Kennedy in 1960, and it's the closest election in U.S. history to that point. The Bush-Gore one in 2000 turns out to be just slightly closer. But most people think the difference was, truthfully, Kennedy was better looking. And if you look at, there are probably lots of articles about this. I don't know if there are whole books about it. But if you look at political scientists writing political scientists about why we elect different people, I wonder about this all the time. Why did we pick Trump over Clinton? Why will we pick whoever we pick this time? The political scientists will look at different factors about the candidates, and if somebody's taller, like substantially taller, we always pick them. If there's a really substantial difference in their attractiveness, we pick the most attractive candidate. If it comes down to skill level, it might be the person who speaks better. And these are things, over time that we've seen. So in the Nixon-Kennedy debate, 1960, it's the first televised presidential debate. If you listen to it on the radio, people who listened to it, 2/3 of them thought Nixon won. And Nixon, he was a well-trained lawyer and liked to argue, so he was good at winning debates and a good speaker. Kennedy was a good speaker as well, but not as great, good prepared public speaker, but not as good in debate. Kennedy was better looking. I know that's a subjective standard, but most people would agree with it. And in this debate, Nixon had gotten an injury that got it infected, so he had a staph infection. So he wasn't feeling well. He was a little sweaty and a little pale, and he refused to wear makeup because that's not a manly thing to do. Kennedy understood that wearing makeup was important when you're on television, and he just was naturally more healthy looking. Now, the truth is Kennedy was a much sicker fellow and had been chronically ill for most of his life, but he looked really healthy. Nixon looked terrible, and the sweating made people think that he was lying, so they thought you couldn't trust him. Both these guys had been in the military. Nixon was in the JAG Corps, and Kennedy won a Purple Heart legitimately. He's one of the very few people you'll see in US history who used his connections to get into the military because he couldn't pass the physical, because of the back problems that he had and some other disease. I can't think of the name of it, but there was some disease that he had that caused chronic pain, so he was on medication for that. So Kennedy uses his connections to get into the military, and then while he's serving in World War II, his PT boat gets cut in half by German sub or Japanese ship. So he ends up swimming and saving like 4 or 5 people and taking them to shore. So he's a legitimate war hero. Oh, I would not be surprised that JFK was less aware of the Great Depression than the average person. His family apparently made most of their money during Prohibition by selling things that were prohibited during that time period. His father also had been an ambassador to England during that time period, during the 30s, and no, before 20s. And when war broke out, he didn't, I guess, was neutral in World War I. And so Kennedy felt like he had to overcome his father's reputation of neutrality, not wanting to fight. And Kennedy's older brother, Joseph, was the one they really thought would be president, and he gets killed in combat in World War II. And then Kennedy has that near miss, and then his brother, Ted, almost dies in a plane crash and then has some other issues later. So Kennedy family, you may have heard people talk about the Kennedy family curse. It may be a real thing. They seem to have issues, don't they? And then JFK Jr., of course, didn't get to live to be a very old man. So it's tough being a Kennedy, even though apparently they're unaware of financial difficulty. That is likely. All right, so I don't want to get too much into the civil rights movement stuff from the 50s, because I figure that's, it's the main focus of our question for next time. So I'll leave a lot of that stuff for later. I will, since we're already talking about Nixon and Kennedy, point out that part of the difficulty that Nixon had with Kennedy, Nixon's got that lower middle class or middle class chip on his shoulder. So it's like, man, I had to scrape for everything I got. I had to earn it. And you just had it given to you on a silver spoon. You didn't even know there was a Great Depression. So, Kennedy, although legitimate war hero, no doubt at all, but Northeastern elitist, gone to Harvard, and never really had to worry about money. Nixon couldn't go to the best schools because his family was poor. And he went to Whittier College, which I'm sure is lovely, in California because he had to stay and work at his family's business, and then went to Duke Law School because that was a law school that working class people could afford back then. My guess is that's no longer true. I know when I did my fellowship to get this fabulous degree that enables me to teach history to you, we had another person in the fellowship from Duke, and bad guy. He was really elitist. So I thought, it made me think, well, goodness, Texas State, Southwest Texas, when I was there, seemed like a fine college, but not to the guy from Duke. So I remember that guy to this day. But Nixon went to Duke back when it was kind of the working class school, not the I got a scholarship to Duke because I play lacrosse school. All right, I'm going to stop talking about Duke and Whittier College and lacrosse scholarships now, and see if you guys have any questions, or at least if you figured out where everyone is from at this point. And then we'll talk quite a bit more next time about the civil rights movement in the 50s, and that might help you hopefully with the question. On the weekly question, I do think you'll want to mention a couple of specific things. You got to mention Brown versus Board of Education. I really think you need to mention the importance of military service to a lot of the leaders of the civil rights movement. And I also think you have to mention the desegregation of the military. So probably not in that order. But World War II service, desegregation of the military, Brown versus Board of Education. We can also discuss next time Little Rock Central, what happens there, and then of course the Montgomery bus boycott, and as the notes mention, the situation with a young man named Emmett Till, which you don't know anything about. This could be, one of the most tragic things you'll ever, well, a very tragic thing. I don't want to overstate it, but it's terrible. It is bad. All right, so before we go, do you guys have any questions? And don't go yet, because I need to solidify the attendance, but I'm just going to see if you have questions I should discuss before we turn off the stuff. I've gotten several emails in the last week about the book review, because I know you got to start thinking about that. It's due in 27 days, so you want to read a book. But I'll give my book review suggestions probably on Thursday for those of you. It's like, I got to do it, but I don't want to. Also, somebody emailed and said, look, I read this book and there's no way I can write 4 to 5 pages about it. There's a way. I promise you, you can. But I told that person, if you do it early enough and send me a draft of it, I will send you some general suggestions. Now, early enough doesn't mean, it's due November 30th, so you send it November 29th. And there's a good chance, I'll tell you this more when we get closer to the time period. I usually go to the homeland for a couple of days, and there's not always internet available in the homeland. Just trust me on this. So, all right, I'm going to stop recording because nobody's asking questions.